Welcome to the High Performance Hockey Podcast. I wanted to take this opportunity for have a solo episode, and the timing of it couldn't be more perfect. I wanted to share some lessons I've learned and some of the changes we've made to our program going into the off season for our hockey players. So I wanted to break this conversation up into three little pieces. Some random bits of information that have really struck a chord with me recently, and some thought process changes. Number two, intern questions. Some questions that we've fielded throughout the years from our interns. We've run intern programs for the better part of 17 plus years. And I've got 3 or 4 questions that have been asked quite frequently over the years. I wanted to share my responses to a larger audience. And then last but not least, a new resource that I've put out called Jump Training for Ice Hockey, a Complementary Approach. I wanted to talk about the guts, the nuts and bolts of this lecture, who it's for, and why I think it's important. So without further ado, a random episode getting ready for the off season. I recently heard a Instagram clip from a former Canadian bobsledder. His name is Ian Danny, and shame on me for not knowing that name. He's been in performance and coaching for the better part of 20 plus years. And I had the opportunity to listen to several of his little mini lectures and lessons he's learned throughout the years, one of which struck a really big chord for me. And he talked about this idea of not so much looking at athletes' weaknesses and trying to correct those weaknesses, but focusing on what got them into the dance in the first place. So we talked about this idea of a deficient-based model. You know, we test, we measure, perhaps it's on force plates, and we look at a left to right propulsive or braking impulse index. And if there's a deficit of 10 to 15%, we want to correct that. Maybe it's an ankle mobility restriction, a hip mobility restriction. And the reality is, for a lot of these situations, these are non-injured athletes, so there's no injury to correct. We're just trying to fix these problems because we feel that there's deficits. All the while, we neglect that performance because we have such little time with them. So I'll give you an idea of the landscape that we live in the private sector. A beautiful program, a long program in the summer would be 16 weeks. That's few and far between. 12 to 14 weeks, that is not a lot of time. And I've caught myself over the years really focusing on that, this deficit-based model. Oh, what are his or her limitations? How do we fix those? Maybe it's PRI, maybe it's DNS. And I'm just throwing those methodologies out there. I still like some of that stuff. But if you're spending 50 minutes trying to fix a breathing imbalance, what are you doing the rest of the time? What got them to the dance in the first place? And Ian had talked about this idea of this performance-based model. What are the KPIs of your sport? And the reality is, the older the athletes get, in my experience, the fewer the KPIs you need to chase. Most of them are on the ice. But what are those KPIs? We have a limited time window to use those. If it's an asymptomatic athlete with no pain, why are we trying to fix those imbalances that haven't caused them problems to begin with? So yes, we measure, yes, we manage, but we really get to programming right off the get-go into our summer programs. How may this affect us? How we might have done this in the past? I love this idea of a tissue remodeling block. But the reality is we don't have a lot of time with our guys. That block that was once 3 weeks, we might do that for a week at best and get right into work with our asymptomatic hockey playing population. So yes, movement matters. Yes, testing matters. That's not the message here. The message is if you keep chasing weaknesses, you don't have time to work on what got them there in the first place. Focus on strength. Random thought number 1. Random thought number 2. I heard a while back an interview from Eric Cressy and Lauren Landau, and he asked the challenges of working in the private sector. He asked Lauren Landau this, and he used this word continuity. And it got me thinking, because we always tell our athletes consistency and intent, consistency and intent. Well, for me, consistency and continuity are not the same thing. They're not the same thing. Consistent, yeah, you can show up every day and do the work. Continuity, are you doing the same program with the same person, with the same coaches? The reality is that is really difficult to do in this current landscape in strength and conditioning. You have a speed person, you have a power person, you have a mental skills coach. And I get it. There's a lot of cooks in the kitchen, but when you get so many cooks in the kitchen, it destroys continuity, and it's a massive, massive challenge. So again, it even reinforces the first concept. When you do get your athletes, remember, we have such a limited amount of time with them. We've got to focus on what's important. We got to focus on what drives performance and really focus on that. And at the same time, I think it's our job as coaches to educate our athletes. We tell our young athletes in the summers two things, and I've repeated this in the podcast many times. If hard work was the key to success, the donkey would run the farm. Work smart, not hard. And the last thing is, what is your goal? Don't think of how many items you can add to your list to accomplish that goal. Trim the fat. If that means working with one or two coaches, do that. But if you have so many cooks in the kitchen, it's very, very difficult to get continuity. And as we all know, adaptation and gains come from consistency over time, but I would argue here, continuity over time matters as well. That's a challenge. And the last random thought that I have is this idea of mobility. The way I've looked at things in the past may be more from this deficit-based model that Ian had referred to. I just looked at this model by Michael Boyle and Gray Cook. I still think it's applicable. So I think it's very useful. But this joint-by-joint approach, ankles are mobile, knees are stable, hips are mobile, the lower back is quote-unquote stable, the thoracic spine is mobile, and we move on up the kinetic chain that way. And I viewed that probably the first decade of my coaching, program ankle mobility exercises such as ankle rocks. We would program ankle swings to get frontal plane ankle mobility. We may program, squat to stand or cook squats for hip mobility. And we still have small doses of that in our programming, but mobility to me is now changed in my mind, specifically for more advanced based players. I think for me, speaking out loud here, this idea of flexibility and mobility are very different. Flexibility is the range of motion around a joint. And then mobility is much more context specific. Can you get in those patterns? Can you sustain those patterns, right? And what I found over time working with more advanced based athletes in terms of training ages, they can get in those patterns, but they can't sustain those patterns. And to me, that mobility is being able to sustain a pattern for time. Yeah, it might be a combination of muscle endurance as well. So maybe for young Tommy, and an athlete with minimal training age, we may do things like ankle rocks and ankle swings and hip mobility exercises. But for our more advanced level athletes, we just do that in very small doses. Instead, we focus on patterns. And what do I mean by that? A lot of the information that we use right now is really stolen from the speed skating literature. And speed skaters spend a lot of time in the off season mastering patterns, specifically getting low. Why does getting low matter? Well, it adds to stride length. If we can get low, we've got a longer stride. Also, when you look at on the ice, what matters most, you're trying to overcome ice friction and air friction. Ice friction is very, very nil. Air friction, much greater. So the lower we can get in our stride, the better we can accomplish those goals. So this idea of mobility for me is sustaining a hockey position for time. So I'll give you an idea of how we may use that for our more advanced level athletes. We may get in a deep, deep hockey stance position, and we might do what we call knee drives. So one leg is lifted, it's extended backwards, and it comes back underneath the hip without touching down. We may do 3 left, 3 right for 20 seconds. From there, we may move on to what we call leg circles. Again, both legs are planted deep in the hockey position, so it's a massive quasi-isometric load there to the quads and glutes. That leg will be extended as in a hockey stride. They'll circle backwards, come right underneath the hip, keeping that leg in the air. 3 on the left, 3 on the right for 20 seconds. And then we might do what we call stride switches. Deep in the hockey position, we stride out to the left, keeping the leg in the air, bringing it back underneath, dropping that leg down, and now alternating to the right side for 20 seconds. That is massively demanding for hockey players. They don't like that. We do it towards the very end of the week. But if you ask me what I define as mobility, it's sustaining that position for time. We are context specific. We're working the ankles, the knees, and the hips. and we're getting low in the process while getting some sort of muscular endurance so we're able to sustain that posture in the season. Again, if you asked me 3 or 4 years ago, it would be much more of that deficit-based model, focusing on joint by joint. Now I want to drive performance. I've got minimal time windows. How can we get lower in that hockey stride? Let's tax mobility in the pattern in which we use it most, right? While getting endurance to that area. So those are all random thoughts as to how my brain has kind of changed around and how I view things, both from a model standpoint. Okay, random thought number one, deficit-based model or performance-based model. I want to drive performance. I've got minimal time to get and accomplish my goals. It doesn't mean we don't focus on deficits, but if it's asymptomatic athletes, let's go to work. Continuity versus consistency. We need to speak to our athletes about that idea of having fewer cooks in the kitchen. What can we take away from our goals, our list to accomplish our goals, trimming the fat to try to reach them, a much more rifle-like approach. And then this idea of mobility, right? Difference between flexibility and mobility. Can we tax these patterns in a specific way and get the best bang for our buck for our athletes? So those were my random thoughts here on a solo episode. I hope they struck a chord and I hope they made sense to you. If you have any questions about those, please shoot us a DM on our Twitter handle. All right, intern questions. Second portion of our chat here. You know, we've had an internship program at Donskoff Strength and Conditioning for the better part of 17 years. We've been in business for 20 years. I'm aging myself now. And we've had some unbelievable interns, some that have gone on to the NBA, professional hockey ranks, major universities. But I always learn just as much from them as hopefully they have from us in the experience. Here are a few questions that have been asked over the years in a repetitive fashion. I figured I'd share with the audience and answer those to a larger population so you can hear if there's some young strength and conditioning coaches out there right now. Number one, qualities. What are great qualities of being a great strength and conditioning coach? And I'll tell you, it's a great question. And I think my answers changed throughout the years, but two things I keep coming back to being a great strength and conditioning coach. Number one, curiosity. You have to be passionately curious to drive the flame of getting better. Like, you have to be. I look at 20 years of doing this, there's a massive monotony to doing what we do. You know, for young Tommy, how many programs look almost identical, right? Goblet squat, pushing and pulling. You're just building an athlete up, right? So you want to challenge yourself to constantly be curious, to constantly ask why, to educate yourself. Some of the best coaches that I know are autodidacts. They're self-taught, which brings up a whole nother portion of this talk, and I could go on and on about. I think our profession should be much less theory-based and much more apprenticeship-based. You have to have these internships. Go shadow people. Go volunteer your time. That's where you're going to learn. A lot of the things you're going to find in a book don't really apply in the applied setting. You know, the old quote from the famous baseball player Yogi Berra, in theory, there is no difference between theory and practice. In practice, there is. So be curious both in the books and reaching out to coaches, but always ask yourself why. I had the opportunity to go back as a 40-year-old to get my PhD. One of the best learning experiences I've ever had. I still ask myself this, why? It keeps me up at night. But one of the things that, you know, really, if someone were to say, what's the one thing you took away from your PhD? I'd say by far, this ability to think like a skeptic. Skeptics don't see the world and ask why things work. It's why they may not work. Who said it? How do they know? What's missing here? What are the assumptions? That's curiosity, curious minds. I truly believe those qualities, the older I've gotten, are hard to teach. I almost think that those are intrinsic. We've had programs at our internship. We have what we call a DSC library, books, DVDs, CDs, over 300 resources we offer our interns year over year. And the reality is, I'd say 5 to 10% of our interns want to check more and more material out. Yes, we have required readings. Yes, we have required viewings and program defenses. That's all great. But be passionately curious. Focus on being passionately curious. So that's the first quality. And the last one, you just got to be a good person, and you have to have a heat meter. It's not the person who's got the loudest mouth in the room. It's not the person that's the smartest in the room. It's the person that reads the room the most. I've said it on this podcast 100 times. Great coaches are a lot like gardeners. Gardeners don't grow flowers. They create an environment for flowers to grow. I had this conversation last week with a young coach of ours. And I told him, I said, if you look at most youth strength and conditioning programs, most youth, what you'll see is way more similarities than differences. Goblet squats, foundational patterns, push, pull, hinge. What separates us or the program from any other place is the coach, the environment, how the athlete feels. The perception of the program may be more important than the program itself. So you've got to be a people person. You've got to be a thermometer. You got to set the thermostat, whether it's the music in the weight room, whether it's getting to know people. I know that sounds like basic stuff, but you'd be surprised year over year over year, more people place value on the theory than we quote unquote soft skills. And I don't think those are soft skills. I think they're super, super important. Curiosity and people skills to me are the marks of a fantastic coach that will make it a long way in this profession. And mark my words, it is a tough profession. It's a humbling profession. We have a supply and demand problem in strength and conditioning. Rest assured, it's not an easy profession to be in, both in the private sector and the professional sector, okay? Second question. Hey, coach, I see you working with the pro athletes. I mean, what's the difference in programming? Well, number one, let me talk to you about the private sector for us. Our pro athletes see us 12 to 16 weeks a year. It's about 5% of the total business that we run. Now, I will also tell you this. A lot of the things that I post on my Instagram site are based on our pro athletes. And a lot of the things I read on social media, I'd say 90% of content, 95% of content is really based for 5% of the population. Literally. Young Tommy, what does young Tommy need? Progressive overload, basic foundational patterns. Continue over time. Pro athletes are a little bit different, in my humble opinion. I wrote a book on it called the Gain, Go, Grow model. A couple things here. Number one, let's talk the sport of hockey. To continue evolving and being elite at hockey, you've got to practice in the environment in which you're played. That's the ice. No one's talking about exhaustive workouts on the ice in the summer, but I strongly believe that skilled touch points are critical. Okay? Number two, training age. Our pro athletes have 7+ years of training age, some up to 14 years, right? In order for us to get an adaptation, we have to put heavier weight on the bar to trip the homeostatic wire. So we have less frequency in the weight room, 3 days a week as opposed to 4, okay? It sounds kind of camouflage. Those other days are their skill days on the ice, right? Their target work, they're refining their skill, okay? The other idea here in terms of our pros is on those off days, restorative measures, right? It takes a lot more weight to trip the homeostatic wire. So we need things that drive parasympathetic tone in their off days, tempo work, massage, hot tub, sauna, etc. We program a little bit different in terms of frequency and intensity and the skill work. And then last but not least, I had a video on Instagram on this. It was really driven by an outstanding article from Stuart McMillan and Dr. Matt Jordan. The article was on reflexive eccentrics, but they talked about this idea of a strength or a force umbrella. And paraphrasing here, but the higher level the athlete, the more you want to experiment underneath this quote unquote umbrella. Young athletes, max force, driving max force efforts, getting stronger and stronger. There comes a limit to this, right? You can only drive intensity and volume up so much. So what I did is I created what I call a strength umbrella. I broke down concentric, isometric, amortization, and eccentric. And I looked at all the different methods that we can use to drive adaptation for our more advanced level athletes. So we use different methods to do that. I'll give you an example. On our go day, reflexive eccentrics. We may use oscillatory training on our go day. We may use overcoming isometrics on our strength day to drive some post-activation potentiation. Our jump training may be different, okay? But this all has to do with this quote-unquote strength umbrella. So we're taxing different methods for our pros as we do with our younger athletes. But the reality is simplicity drives both programs, but for different reasons. Simple because young Tommy needs nothing but progressive overload and get stronger. Simple for our pro athletes in the fact that they need to focus on what gets them to the dance, that skill work on the ice, coupled with a simple program where they can adapt. We have that model. We call it the Gain, Go, Grow model. So that is an intern question that we field a lot. And again, For everybody that watches my Instagram, I want to be very transparent. Again, a lot of the video that you see are our pros, right? That's the sexy stuff. But 95%, if I, put that on video, just be basic stuff for our young athletes, right? Really basic. All right. Third question for our interns. What should I read, coach? How do I get better? I think it depends on how you learn. Are you a block learner? Do you want to focus on one category at a time, or are you a random learner? Do you like to vary up your learning? I was more of a block learner, so I like to read books that were targeted for periods of time, and then I'd change the subject. But I think for me, if I could give advice to my 20-year-old self, here's what I would think. There are two major principles in strength and conditioning that you need to focus on and read. Number one, specific adaptation to imposed demands. So that is massively important to understand. So understanding physiology at a deeper level, to me, is really, that's a macro principle. And then general adaptation syndrome, Hans Selye. Those are two macro principles. Again, both of them are kind of married in physiology, but those are two areas that I would massively concentrate on if I'm a young coach. And then I call the other ones micro principles, but there's some overlap. I call these the Swiss Army knife, right? You've got programming, you've got physics, you've got physiology, you have psychology, and you have biomechanics. Those topics would be littered on my bookshelf, and they have been, the first 15 years of my coaching career. I will say this, the last 5 years of my coaching career, my book readings have been very, very different, right? Gerd Gigerenzer, Nassim Nicholas Taleb, books on statistics, books on critical thinking. I believe that all of those books relate to strength and conditioning, but they're not so much the target of those first principles that I really got into when I was a young coach. So those are 3 intern questions that have been fielded over the years. I hope that you can take away if you're a young coach listening. All right, last topic here of our solo episode. Jump training for ice hockey, a complementary approach. This is a new resource that I put together. And if someone were to ask me, what's the one coaching change that you've had in your program for your more advanced level athletes over the years, last 2 years, what would be the biggest change? Without a doubt, it would be jump training. I think for me, it's a combination of 2 things. Number one was understanding at a much deeper level biomechanics. I went back as a 40-year-old PhD student at the University of Western Ontario, and one of the things that I did for my candidacy exam was to do a deep dive in biomechanics. And what I found in the sport of ice hockey, we don't have a ton of information. Some great information coming out of Canada, McGill University on biomechanics, but what I found is I kept coming back to older and older literature that was based on speed skating and some unbelievable research in speed skating. And then understanding that, what the goal is in speed skating, get low, try to eliminate air friction, get length in your strides, right? But this biomechanics, specifically for hockey, run to glide. Okay, run is 2 to 3 steps, and we're trying to have shallow joint amplitudes and really hammer into the ice. Unimodal force production, that means we're striking one time and driving, and then getting into glide. Glide much deeper joint amplitudes. Bimodal, that means we drive and then we toe off, right? So we've got 2 different parallels here. Run to glide. And by the way, run might not be a dead stop. It might be stopping, changing directions in a game, but we still have got the need for that. And then I looked at this idea of slingshots, stretch shortening cycle areas of the ankles and knees, and then the hips. And I think with traditional jump training, we focus on the ankles and the knees. How do we target that for hockey players? For example, when you're in that glide position and the swing leg comes back underneath the hip, how can we focus on that hip slingshot to get that leg back underneath explosively? So biomechanics really started my thinking into possibly this idea of how we bucket our jumps for hockey players. Had the opportunity to interview a friend of mine, Joel Becker, and he talked to me about several speed skaters and showed me a few of their videos and how they've trained. And I thought, wow, this all makes sense to me. I really want to focus and change some of the things that we do for our more advanced level athletes. So that was really the impetus in putting this product together. Some of the changes that we've made in our jump training. I think also for me, one of the things that really got me and really made me change and grow in a good way was Dr. Keith Barr. His work is referenced in this presentation a ton. But the goal here, and he talks about tendon stiffness. If you're a strength and conditioning coach and you're working with high-level athletes and you're doing jump training, I would suggest that probably everybody on this listening, the goal is stiffness, right? I always use that analogy, the slingshot. If we pull back a really stiff slingshot and we let it go, we got dangerous recoil, right? We want stiffness. So I come back to a Patrick Ward quote. What's the adaptation you're looking for? What's the method? And then choose the exercise. Well, this is stiffness. And we have several ways that we can adjust our programs as strength and conditioning coaches. And we've got exercise order, we've got tempo, we've got rest. One of the things that Dr. Keith Barr said is the king of kings is velocity. And the reason that is the case is because when we move really, really, really fast, the tendon moves in a sheet and creates increases in cross linkages, which increases tendon stiffness. So we talk about that in this lecture series. And then we talk about how we bucket our jumps, right? We bucket our jumps based on impulse, the interval of time over the integral of force. How do we bucket those jumps? I titled this lecture, I used the word jump training for ice hockey, not plyometric training for ice hockey. Because what you'll see in this video is a combination of both. And I think it's important. I had a conversation with a young coach. Understand the difference. I know probably to some it's minutiae and maybe a little bit more word soup, but if you look at the old Russian literature, true plyometrics are minimal ground contact time. What they would say is 0.15 seconds from Dr. Michael Yesis, and that's out of the Soviet literature. Most jump training is a lot longer ground contact time. So we understand the difference between true plyometrics and jump training. Now, in this lecture series, you'll see both and how we program those from the run standpoint and the glide standpoint. So how we bucket our jumps. And then I think for young coaches, for any coaches, complementing the training means. I always say peanut butter and jelly go a lot better with peanut butter and sardines. So if you look at a microcycle, where are those jumps being placed? Where are they going to be placed? I think that matters, and I think it's really, really important for the programming. So we talk about that in this lecture series as well. So we talk about biomechanics, adaptation, this idea of stiffness, why it's important, understanding the physiology, a lot of that information, again, driven by Dr. Barr, how we program, how we bucket our plyos, and then this idea of complementary training means. So this is a new resource that you can find on Gumroad. If you just put Gumroad and Anthony Donskoff, I will also link this resource to the program notes so that you're able to see, where that video is coming from. I would urge you as well, if there are any other additional questions that you want me to speak about on the podcast, please feel free to drop us a DM on our Twitter handle, and I'll be happy to answer those questions. It's always fun, both for me to be on the podcast, to learn from our guests, to hopefully leave the game in a better place and grow knowledge and do that on a wider audience and a wider forum. But I really appreciate you listening, and I hope you pick some things up from this episode. Again, it's the start of the off season. It's a great time for us as strength and conditioning coaches. I think for me, the big ones for me is it a performance-based model? Is it a deficit-based model? If someone's asymptomatic, let's rock and roll. Let's focus on what got you to the dance, right? Those are areas. Small, tight windows, this idea of mobility and how that's changed in my mind drives some new ideas for my programming. So 20 years into this, I can tell you, I'm still making subtle changes in my programming based on more information, based on getting one day better. Be better today than you were yesterday, every day. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.